To work on creating the cutter, what we're going to need is 2 layers of artwork, so then we can understand how this works. So if you imagine we're creating either an eye socket and moving the eye within the eye, or we're creating the iris and pupil on the eye and animating that across the surface of the eye, or I mean, you can imagine it in any of these constructs, but that makes for a very easy shape to work with. So I'm just going to grab my paintbrush, make my brush a little bit bigger, and as I go to draw, just create basic round object. Now, as I work with this, it's useful, especially as we start organizing and sorting our layers, to add in a name to the layer. If we just leave it as drawing and drawing 1 and drawing 2 and drawing 3 and drawing 4, then we have no clue what is what. So it's useful to name them. In this case, in this instance, I'm going to name these layers based on the colors that I'm using, so it's even easier to keep track of what is what as we are further working on the project. Because this is a project that has a number of little detail gotcha moments, so it's important that we can understand it, and hopefully this file will be a nice takeaway when it's done. So I'm going to label this layer blue. I'll let this be my blue layer, and I will fill that in with blue in a little bit. Add a second drawing layer in, and on this drawing layer and this layer, then I will probably make it red. I could even add in some extra lines, so then when I do fill it in with red, it has a little extra pizzazz or color to it. So I can go grab red, fill in on my red, and I will name my layer red. So again, so it's easy to keep track of it, switch down to the blue layer, and I'm going to just add a different blue because I want something that's not quite so blue. But I want to just lighten it up a little bit and change the tone a little so it's just a little nicer shade of blue. Color that in. And give it a name. So we have my blue and red. So after these 2 layers have been added, what we're going to do is start adding in some pegs and organizing our layers and working with that. Remembering lessons from the past, we can pull up our network toolbar under Windows, toolbars network, and that pulls up our network toolbar, so I can click on display and choose order up to fan things out so I get a little nicer layout. Now, looking in the small network view sometimes is troubling because you can't see very much. So I like to, in my main screen area, add in a second view of my network view. So I add that in so I can now see a much bigger point of view. So it's easier to see what's going on. And if you have a Gigantor monitor or 2 monitors, you can split your palettes and windows between different screens so you can keep everything up. You can be really spoiled. But if you are stuck working on a laptop or a smaller display like mine, then you have to suffer through a little bit. So after I have these layers configured, I want to add in pegs for these layers, so I can highlight those layers, and then I can hit Command-Shift-P in the network view. In the timeline view with the layers highlighted, I can click on the Add Peg icon. Both of those will serve the same purpose. Always name your layers before you add your pegs, so that when you add your pegs, the layers, or the peg layers, take on the same naming convention as your drawing layers. So always name your drawing layers, add your pegs is the next step. And finally, what I will want to do is I want to add in one more peg that will be a master peg, so I can have one control peg for moving this whole object around as well. Imagining that as we build larger and more complex structures, it makes sense that we do have that master peg at our disposal. So with that, in the network view, I can just hit Command-P. That adds in a peg. It'd be good to rename that. You click on the yellow box in the network view, and that pulls up the options for that layer item. And now I can just call this master P. So it's my master peg. As we continue forward looking in the network view, I have my master peg, which is not connected to anything, and I'm going to connect the pipes from my master peg to the pegs for my to layers. That gives me, I can now move the master peg and that will move both elements, or I can click on an individual layer peg to move an individual element. So if I toggle back to my camera view and grab one of my animation tools, because animation tools are what I use for working with my pegs. So as I do that, I'm just adjusting my network view so I can see the different pegs. Under tool properties, I want to make sure that I always have my select peg option on, so I'm not accidentally grabbing artwork. Because if it's turned off, and then I try and click on something to move it, it chooses the artwork. So I'm now actually moving artwork. I'm not moving the peg. And when we're animating, we really want to try and be animating the peg. Otherwise, what happens is if we move the artwork, it's moving the artwork on that layer, and that could now render 10, 20, 50, or 200 or 2,000 frames totally wonked and broken, because as I move the artwork, it will apply that movement across the whole layer. So that's why we animate on pegs, because then it automatically, provided you have the auto keyframe running man turned on, it will automatically insert keyframes for that. So when we animate, we always want to be using the peg layer, so that when I select that I'm using pegs, that way, no matter what I choose, it will always be choosing the pegs. So the goal here is we're trying to get so that the inner circle, when it crosses the boundary of the outer circle, that it disappears. Or if I move the outer circle, the inner circle won't show up when it's beyond it. So that's what we're trying to get to. Now I'm going to switch over to my network view. As I look at this, what's going to end up happening is I'm going to have a whole bunch of layers going on in a little bit, and a few extra things with it that we may find it gets easier, that it's possible to group a series of layers into a composition so that our overall network view is much more contained. So if you imagine that when you're animating, you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 characters on screen. If you imagine all the layers for all of those characters showing up in your network view at the same time, it might get a little unwieldy. We have an option to construct additional compositions. So right here we can see where here we have a composite. I can now take all these layers and effectively group them into a single entity and work with that entity. And the way that we do that is we highlight those layers, and then I'm going to right click, and you will notice that there's an option under group where I can group it, which I could do, but I don't want to do that. I want to choose group selection with composite. And when I choose that, we will notice how what was a whole bunch of layers now just becomes one. This allows us to start making things more manageable. So entire characters can be broken into single compositions, and once it is a single composition like this, it actually becomes much easier for us to even move or share items between projects. So I can actually now take this item and I can export it out as a template object and then import it into any new project down the road. So we have a lot of power with this. Now, if I look at this, I will notice one thing is it took on the name of one of my layers, and I may not like that name. So I can modify it by clicking on the yellow square next to it, and then I can type in a different name. I would advise you to leave the -G after to indicate this is a group composition, so when you quickly scan the layers, you can see that, oh yes, this is a group. And I'm going to call mine eyeball.
Mine says PB.
After your new group composite has been renamed, if you click on the arrow on the right-hand side of it, you will be able to see the layers. If you click on the left-hand arrow next to the gold box, it shows you a thumbnail. So the thumbnail can be useful when you have lots of layers and you just want to see what they are, or lots of groups, so you can quickly see what they are. But if I click on the arrow to the right of it, it actually brings me into that grouping. I end up with a multi-port in, multi-port out, and if I click this top arrow up here, it brings me back out. So while I'm inside it, I can now see the network that is happening. I can see what is going on inside this group. And we will see that it's going to a new composite. So this is like building intermediate compositions or intermediate groups that we can use to help organize our structures. And as our projects grow in complexity, doing this will keep you at least a little bit more sane. I won't promise complete sanity, but a little bit more. So it's helpful. Now what we're going to do is to introduce a couple of other entities that we have not seen yet. And these entities reside in our module library. The module library is like our plugins. So if we imagine, and one of the groups of modules is in fact called plugins, but if we go to all of them, we can see what's there. So we can see that we have just a whole variety of different things available that are plugins, filter effects, and other things that can be useful to us as we work on our project. So we can use these to do some pretty nice things. It defaults with favorites, and the two that we need today are located in our favorites section. So in our favorites tab of the module library and the default layout is in your timeline panel down at the bottom. So you go to module library, and what we need is the cutter. So you just drag that into your network, and we will also need color override. So we drag that into our network as well. What these modules are going to allow us to do is to perform a type of masking. And within it, we get to specify what color we want to mask against which color and how we want the cutting of that to take place. So to make that happen, we will notice that within these modules that they have inputs on them and an output. So we have inputs and an output. So the color override can even attach a peg to it, so it can be attached to its own peg, or it can be attached to the peg of an existing item on screen. If you don't attach a peg pipe to it, when you animate the object that you're using this color override with, the color override will stay put on screen and won't move. So it's important that we tie the peg of the appropriate element. So in this case, I'm using blue, the kind of the white of my eye, the background area. We will be using its peg as part of this process. And now what we're going to do is we end up with a color override and a cutter. I'm just going to spread mine out a little bit more so I have more room on screen. So I have a color override. Now, when you work with these and drag them around, you can actually take the pipes from different layers and you can just drag them right into items. So I can drag the artwork that I want to be cut into the right port. Typically, the port that has, if you zoom in real far, you'll notice it almost has like a little play triangle in it. So you'll see like one port has a triangle, one does not. Or one, it's kind of a dot at low resolution. But if you keep in mind that that is typically that's the port of what you want to be affected. So we want red to be cut. Red is my iris pupil area of the eye, so I want that to be cut as part of this. And I want to then designate with a color override, and we will look at how to make that happen in just a moment. And I will connect color override to the other part of my cutter. Now, currently my color override is left going, okay, but what color do you want to override to make this cutting action take place? And it's going to be the color coming from the blue. That means we drag blue into our color override so that we can see it. And we will notice that red is no longer in the composite. So at the moment, red is going into the right input of the cutter. And if I go back and look at my camera view, we'll notice that it disappeared. One thing to keep in mind, if something you have on screen does not connect to a composite, we don't get to see it. So if I have a drawing layer just floating around in space and it never connects into a composite, we never get to see it. It could be the best drawing ever, but if it's not tied to a composite, we don't get to see it. If I look at my main view here, so we can see this group connects to my composite. Composite goes to display. Display means we get to see it on screen. But red is no longer connected. Red has lost its way. It's sad. But we can bring red back by connecting it to the composite. Now if I go to my camera view, well, it's still not quite working yet. And because of the slightly finicky nature of what we're doing here, we are going to have to kind of work with this a little bit. Now if I go to camera view, animate, oh look. So red is kind of working. But now I selected the peg for my red layer, grabbed the move tool, the animate move tool, or translate tool to be proper with my name. If I look in the camera view, I can say, okay, it moves around. It's not there yet. It's not working quite right. Even though red goes into the cutter, red is on top. Anything to the left on a composite should be on top. So what we're running into is a little like, it's not quite working yet. And what we need to do is we need to actually now specify what color is doing the cutting. And we have to do one extra thing on our cutter is we end up having to click the yellow box on your cutter. And what we're going to do is say, I want objects to show when they're on top, but not when they go outside. So it looks like this. Look at that. So we're now able to be inside and outside. A question came up of, we noticed that the black outline doesn't extend all the way around. In this instance, it's not huge because the line is narrow, but as we can see that the artwork is going. So when we use these color overrides and cutters and things like that, what's really happening as part of this is we're going to be limited in terms of how we're able to cut things out, but we can now be a little bit more selective, and there's a couple tricks that we can employ in our bag as part of this. So one of the things that we can do is we can find out that, and when you look in your timeline, you'll see where it says your group, and then you'll realize, well, wait, the group, I can't extend it until you click the plus next to the group name, and then it extends, and now you get to see all your layers again, and it's all nice and pretty. But when I look at a drawing layer and pull up the layer properties, inside my layer properties, I have access to transformation, drawing, and advanced. And by default, when we look in the drawing tab, what you will see on the drawing is we have an overlay, a line art, a color art, and an underlay art. So what is actually occurring inside every drawing layer that you create is every drawing layer actually is comprised of 4 layers. There's a line art layer, an overlay layer, an underlay layer, and a color art layer. By default, when you are drawing on a given layer, so you're using a paintbrush or pencil or something, by default it usually dumps your artwork onto the line art layer. So it assumes that you're painting on the line art layer. And I did my lines, I did my fills, I did everything on that layer, and that's okay. That's normal as you're working. But we have these 4, overlay, line art, color, and underlay layers that we can work with. So we can actually do some things to our advantage here. We can take advantage of the fact that each layer is comprised of 4 and work with it. So as I look at this and realize that when I want to animate my eyeball and I want that black line to stay on top, what I really want is a copy of that black line. But I don't necessarily want to have to redraw that line because that would really suck, especially when we're working with this and have the ability to automate some of these things a little bit more. So one way that we can go about doing this, one technique that we can use, is I can pull up my drawing tab. So I can click on the arrow and choose drawing, or I can go under Windows and choose drawing, and that pulls up your drawing view. Now in the drawing view we get to see the artwork that's there. If we want to see other additional layers, if we have other layers of artwork, we can turn on light table. In this case we won't get to see much because they're on top of each other, but if I had, like I had arms, leg, background and everything, light table would allow me to see that, though it would ghost those layers out. So when I look at this layer, we can see that it's in the line art layer. If I switch over to my color art layer, it goes away. My underlay layer, it goes away. So we can see that. And my overlay, all of these layers, it goes away. It's all inside my line art layer. In my drawing window, I am going to use my select tool, and I'm going to just click and select my stroke, the dark area that goes around. Now, if you painted, when you painted your item, let me just select my color, I'll go back to black. If when you painted you used a lot of strokes to try and build it up, so you're really kind of working it with a bunch of pieces and then you color it in to build your strong darks, if I go and select this, I will realize it's a whole bunch of pieces. And well, that will kind of possibly be annoying to work with. Now, one thing that I can do, well, if I have selected something, is I can now take all of this, and when it's all highlighted, I do have the option under drawing, and then under optimize, I can flatten it. And if I flatten what I've done, it does turn that into just one solid shape. So if when you're drawing you create a whole bunch of lines because that's just how your drawing style works, you can select all of those colors, those different marks, and then flatten it so it's just one shape that you're working with. So that can be a way to work with this, because otherwise, if this is on the side of my artwork and we look at it like that, in my camera view, when I go to animate, we will see that it's going to the outer edge. So that if I want it to disappear when it hits the black, that's not really giving me a good effect. So we need to do something about that. So as I move this, the mask shape isn't working quite right, and I want that black to sit in front. Now, one thing that we can do when we work with this is in my drawing view, my fill and my line art, it all ended up on the same layer because it's a very common way that you would draw. It's quick, it's easy, it works. But what I can do is I can now, with my select tool, I can select all of the black that I see here. So I've selected the black. Or I could select everything and then we'll delete the blue afterward if it's a more complex selection. So if your selection is really hard to grab, you select everything, copy it. Then what we're going to do is click over to the color art layer. It remembered some of the scribbling I was just doing. In my color art layer here, then I can choose paste. So now my line art and my color art look about the same, but I want my color art to only be the black. And I have a little missed dot up there, which means it's here as well. All right. So my line art layer includes everything. My color art layer just includes the stroke. So these are probably misnamed and could have been switched around where the artwork was, but it all works. After we have this set up, then what we are going to do is we are going to use a duplicate copy of this layer inside our network view. And this is something that if I'm working just in a timeline view, this is a technique that you physically just cannot do. This is why working in a timeline view is going to be so important, or in the network view is going to be so important. Final steps to continue working with our cutter here is if we jump over to our network view now. In the network view, I'm going to take that blue layer, which I have now added in. It has now an additional layer modification to it. I'm going to just click on that layer. I'm going to copy, and then I will choose paste, and now I end up with a duplicate copy of blue. Then, and this is where the cool part happens, we want it to use the same peg as blue so that when I move one, it moves the other. And that's one of the things you can't do just in the timeline. You can't control multiple layers of the same item with the same peg. You can't even have multiple layers of the same item if you're just in a timeline view. That's where it gets a little, difficult to manage. That's why the network view is so powerful. Now I can drag this new blue and put an additional pipe into my main composite here inside this grouping. So
On the left.
we put it on the left so it sits on top of the eye. Now if I go to my camera view, we'll notice that the red of the eye has now disappeared. That's okay.
I have a quick question. When I move to the left,
To complete this process, what we need to do is we need to modify which of the layers we're seeing at any given time. Remembering that if I click on the yellow box, I get the layer properties. In the layer properties, I can see overlay, line, color, and underlay.
how do you
The
get there again?
4 properties. Yellow box.
No box with the, on the blue.
So I've brought up the properties for my blue layer, and I'm going to, I wouldn't recommend you bring up both simultaneous, but I'm going to bring up the properties for blue 1 so we can see both, so I can see the side-by-side difference that we're going to make. So I have blue and blue 1. Blue 1 is the second layer that I added, and that's the layer that is on top of the cutter in my composite. And for that layer, I want to say, show me the color art, which is just the outline. And for my original blue, I can just leave it, or I could even turn off color so that we can see how they're now, the two complete the whole. So what we're able to do is we're able to have 2 copies of the same artwork, but because the artwork is comprised of a possible 4 separate layers, on one copy we show one of its layers, and on the other copy we show the other layers. Now, because I'm not even using overlay or underlay, I could even just turn those off if I wanted to be a purist and make sure I'm being really particular about what I'm doing. But the big thing is that one is using line art, one is using color art. But they are both derived from the same drawing layer. They're 2 instances of the same drawing layer. So this is where we get some really interesting things that can occur. Now that additional new layer sits on top. So new layer, cutter, old layer. And now in my camera view, when I animate my eye, we will now see how it goes behind that line. So it seems to stay inside. It's trapped in the fishbowl, if you want to think of it in that capacity.
Layer you want.